That kind of reminds me of, do you all remember in Living Color, Cephas and Reese? Cephas and Reese? Yeah, I think that's what it was. It was Kim Wayans and David Alan Grier. And they would be, they both had those Jerry girls. And they'd be like, ah! It was fantastic. Me and my mom would talk about that all the time. Anytime a singer is like doing way too many runs, on a song, we were like, why she sound like Cephas and Reese? So anywho, so we're in part 2. I made it. Just barely. I was trying very, very hard to do this and to deliver this on time because I want to go on to another topic. I think I'm getting to that point now where I'm like, these really incredibly ambitious episodes are starting to kind of take a toll on me. So, but anyway, I'm grateful for you. Welcome back and happy birthday to Dustin. Dustin's birthday was yesterday. We both turned 40. We're a week apart. And yeah, we got a trip coming up in June. I'm super excited about that. Looking forward to that. If you are friends with Dustin on any of the social medias, which you probably just see him on TikTok here and there, feel free. Drop him a dime. Tell him happy birthday. So what are we about to do? We're about to go into season 4, episode 12, part 2. We talked about last episode, Lawrence E. King Jr. and the Franklin scandal. I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed actually physically having to read a book because usually I have audiobooks and then I mark up. I have the audiobook that I can listen to while I'm working, and then I mark up usually an ebook, or if I have the actual book, I mark up the book so I can do my notes, so I can write my summary. This was actually really difficult because I did realize, and I know this to be true, that it's actually quite hard trying to do this with a physical book because I have to actually sit down and read it. I can't be in the gym listening to stuff, you know what I mean? And marking things, and it's just, it's a lot easier when I have audio, but whatever, that's millennial problems. Also still not drinking, but I do drink. I want to clear that up. I do drink. I just choose now to drink on Fridays or weekends. That's a personal thing. So I'm drinking water. I'm trying to stay hydrated. I've been working on my inner thighs a lot. So I've been doing a lot of lymphatic drainage. So I'm trying desperately. I take my electrolytes every day. I'm going to the gym 4 times a week. I'm rubbing out my thighs like crazy. That's so bad that they're bruised. So, I probably should chill for a minute, but I have to stay hydrated. So that's another reason why I'm drinking a lot of water instead of alcohol. But you can drink whatever you want. Okay. The poison on this episode was the Vixen. It was 1.5 ounces of reposado tequila. It was 1 ounce of sherry. It was 3/4 ounce of champagne corn cob syrup, which we talked about. It's on the internet. Figure out how to make that if you want that. But this was the Vixen. And I actually really look forward to trying this. I'm not a big fan of champagne, but whatever. If you try it, let me know what it tastes like on my TikTok or something. Hit me up. Meanwhile, on TikTok, if you didn't know, on all my episodes, if you want to follow me on TikTok, I really only have TikTok. I'm not on Instagram or Facebook, but my handle is in the show notes, Sorta Drunk Pod. And you could find my real TikTok, my personal TikTok on there too, where I just curse a lot and talk about politics all day. I'm getting really annoyed. I'm really annoyed. I've been annoyed for almost 2 years now. But anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about what we're here to talk about. Now, excuse me, before we continue, I do want to say that you're probably like, what's with all the legalities? I know, I'm just, I'm blatantly mentioning people's names and stuff, and I always kind of do, but I feel compelled in this one to just say that Many of the allegations in this portion of the case were never criminally proven. Some of the witnesses, they later recanted while others maintain their stories. So I'm just going to tell you that up front. I'm presenting this in the way that it was alleged, though, what was documented in the book. And we're just going to take it from there. We're just going to say that. Now, part one kicks off in the 1980s, Nebraska. It was a time when the crumbling farm economy and failing local banks and suffocating political networks created the perfect breeding ground for corruption. And in this wide open state, power was concentrated in a small circle of elites and, according to those on the inside, heavily protected. So enter John DeCamp, who's the writer of this book. The state senator who argued that the government's handling of financial disasters, specifically the Commonwealth savings collapse, which we talked about in part one, was a literal blueprint for shielding political insiders while the average citizen got slaughtered. Then we meet the man of the hour, Lawrence E. King Jr. He was a charismatic powerhouse, a GOP insider. King leveraged his position to turn the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union into a beacon of North Omaha Black success before it became his personal piggy bank and the whole thing collapsed. But by the late 1980s, $40 million vanished into thin air. And what started as an embezzlement investigation quickly turned into a horror story when witnesses, many of them children from foster cares in Boys Town, began spilling disturbing allegations tied directly to King's elite social circle. So the testimony detailed a literal web of organized abuse, exploitation, and network of untouchable elites. A survivor presented accounts of rituals in part one and violence so extreme that they still remain very, very much so disputed, and they never saw the inside of a courtroom. So by the end of part one, we're left with a big question. How does a $40 million banking scandal morph into the most controversial and disputed abuse case in American history without anyone really being held accountable? So, sip. Agua. Now, to determine what happened to the millions missing from Franklin, the National Credit Union Association, the NCUA, hired a private firm. And in their audit of Franklin, DeCamp was like super skeptical. He didn't think that King could have possibly spent that money alone. And the committee began to realize that the people cleaning up the financial mess were connected to the players who created it. Now, this is not going to be really about his financial crimes. This part is more so about the other stuff. Okay. So by the end of December of 1988, Senator Ernie Chambers makes a public announcement that the probe must now include the physical and sexual abuse of children by persons connected to Franklin, warning that people holding official jobs would be affected. And Chambers was outraged. He was criticizing the inexcusable delays in investigating the leads. By February 1989, the legislature's Franklin Committee hired its first independent investigator, Jerry Lowe. He was a former Lincoln policeman. Lowe described the case as complex and complicated, noting that it goes far beyond financial corruption. And Lowe's memo officially expanded the scope of the investigation to include influence peddling, child abuse and neglect, child sexual abuse, pornography, substance abuse, homicide, and potential malfeasance on the part of public officials and law enforcement agencies. The exploitation of children was a documented phenomenon dating back years. So Lowe dropped another banger, another one, suggesting that the Franklin funds weren't just being embezzled for personal luxury, but they were part of a larger systemic web of corruption, including guns, money, and transfers into Nicaragua, aka Iran-Contra. and had connections to the CIA. But, surprise. You didn't think we were going to get the CIA back in this, did you? A link between the missing Franklin millions, the national savings and loan crisis, and the funneling of money to Haiti, and the possibility of a direct connection to the White House implied that King's influence reached the highest levels of the executive branch, and it's no doubt he was protected. Now, Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman had personally stayed at Larry King's residence in Washington, D.C. This has established an intimate connection between law enforcement and King, explaining why Wadman insisted that, quote, every step that should have been taken was taken. But when the legislative committee started their hearings on June 22nd, 1989, they were met with resistance. Attorney General Spire testified that based on reports from the FBI, the Omaha Police, and the Nebraska State Patrol, the allegations of child abuse had no substance. Spire also claimed that his office acted promptly and professionally, exposing total confidence that law enforcement, both state and federal, was doing its job. Now, DeCamp admits that during the early months of the Franklin probe that he personally had serious doubts about the validity of child abuse allegations and provided only a minimum of legal advice. DeCamp had also had his own fair share of abuse allegations during his 1984 Senate campaign. So he got it. He understood how this worked. By the spring of 1989, Senator Schmidt was looking for a way out of this madness. He turned to DeCamp for counsel on a committee report. He trusted DeCamp. The draft didn't pull any punches, though, alleging that the prominent individuals were up to their necks in child abuse, while government agencies conveniently looked the other way. So DeCamp doubled down on his survival strategy. If you're going after the elite, you better have a smoking gun. He argued that while a false accusation is a tragedy, a systemic cover-up of the slaughter of innocent children is a literal sin against humanity. By July 1989, a major controversy broke out within the Franklin Committee regarding Schmidt's leadership and the direction of the investigation. Schmidt argued that the information gathered by the investigator was mostly hearsay, and he felt they should just follow the money because he believed that important crimes always leave a paper trail: checks, credit card receipts, flight manifests. As a person who is an accountant, myself, it's true. You can't follow the money. But, sometimes the money is like cash, and people really do put a lot of effort into covering up cash transactions. So Investigator Lowe resigned. And by August 1989, the committee brought in Gary Caradori. He was a former state patrolman, and he was assigned to pick up where Lowe left off. Now, right out of the gate, Caradori hit a massive wall of public mistrust. People were skeptical of the legislative committee for two reasons, and they were big. Potential witnesses were absolutely terrified of retaliation from the people they were accusing, which of course, and there was a very real fear that coming forward meant being publicly smeared or discredited by the papers, specifically the Omaha World Herald. On August 30th, 1989, Gary Caradori sat down with Millie Boggs. This was the director of the Omaha Children's Home. Boggs was very disturbed by the suspicious way state social workers were passing children around like currency, and she pointed directly to the abrupt, unexplained exits of high-level officials who suddenly started living like bosses. They had new condos and exotic vacations that their government paychecks couldn't possibly cover. So Millie Boggs, her testimony painted a sickening picture of a systemic revolving door where children were being moved through the system by powerful elites, despite every red flag in the book. This was just more proof that the Franklin Credit Union Circle had its claws deep in local social work and welfare. They were controlling the placements to keep their machine running. But by this point, the public was completely over it. The lack of progress from previous investigators had everyone discouraged. Caradori knew that hearsay was great for mapping out how deep it all went. It was functionally worthless for a legal prosecution, though. And he decided that his main mission was to find the actual survivors, the ones who had lived through the abuse and the activities. And he had to get them on the record. He actually pulled it off, too, because between late 1989 and early 1990, Caradori managed to record nearly 30 hours of videotaped testimony from 4 key victims. On October 30th, 1989, Caradori and his assistant traveled to the Women's Reformatory in York, Nebraska, to interview 21-year-old Alicia Owen, who was incarcerated on a bad check conviction. After a 3-hour session, Owen began to open up. She admitted to being heavily involved with various individuals, including former members of the Franklin Credit Union. Back in 1983, at the age of 14, Alicia was introduced to Larry King Jr. by boys from Boys Town, which is a famous orphanage and youth treatment center located just outside of Omaha. These boys were sitting ducks, as wards of the state with zero family advocates to look out for them. They were ultimate targets for the network, and Larry King and his cohorts basically had a key to the campus. They were checking children out for weekend trips and parties under the veil of mentoring or charitable outings. Now, Alicia describes her arrival at the Twin Towers penthouse around 10 p.m. She was told beforehand that there would be so much cocaine available that she would think it was snowing. They also had marijuana and alcohol. So Alicia said that she saw a professionally made pornographic tape featuring 2 males, approximate age 17, engaged in homosexual acts. She alleged that she personally saw Larry King Jr. go into a bedroom with a young black boy. And in one of the most damaging allegations, she reported seeing a 14-year-old boy sitting on a man's lap before the 2 of them entered the bedroom together. Around September 21st or 22nd, 1983, shortly after her 15th birthday, Alicia describes a third gathering at the Twin Towers penthouse. Now, based on Alicia's testimony, investigator Gary Caradori recommended that 62 individuals and various documents be subpoenaed. The primary alleged perpetrators named by her were Larry King, you know him, Harold Anderson, the publisher of the Omaha World Herald, Alan Baer, a wealthy businessman and the heir to J.L. Brandeis and Sons department store fortune, DeWard Finch, the superintendent of Fort Calhoun High School, Peter Citrone, a well-known restaurant critic and columnist for the Omaha World Herald, and Judge Theodore Carlson, a Douglas County District Court judge. But then there was Robert Wadman, chief of the Omaha Police Department. Now, Wadman sat Alicia on his lap, unzipped her jumpsuit, and began touching her genitally. And when she asked him to stop, he reportedly grabbed her wrist so tight that he twisted it. He then forced her to perform oral sex on him while he pinned her down on a cushion. Alicia described vomiting in the bathroom immediately following the incident. And later that evening, Wadman took her to the French Cafe, where he gave her a new dress. He then took her to the wine cellar, where he forced her onto a table and sexually assaulted her again. Alicia stated that she was crying throughout the ordeal because she was afraid that he would rape her. Alicia described being photographed as well, specifically while being restrained during these parties. And during her interview, she became very upset when she was discussing her interactions with Bob Wadman. Wadman reportedly claimed that King owed him a lot for the favors he had performed, suggesting that the kids were used as currency to maintain these corrupt relationships. Now, she identifies Rusty Nelson, who we talked about in part 1, as a 27-year-old man with blonde hair and acne scars. He was the likely photographer. She alleges that Larry King Jr. also participated in taking these photographs. Alicia also claims that Bear would cruise the old market area for young boys, take them back to his office, and have them run naked on a treadmill while he watched. She discusses Anderson's specific preferences, stating he liked young boys and had a regular who was approximately 14 years old. She claims to have witnessed young boys performing oral sex on him. Now, Alicia also mentions the presence of a superintendent of a school. That's a quote. She described him as a man who was older, balding, had bad teeth, and stands approximately 6 feet tall, was found to match Deward Finch, the former superintendent of Fort Calhoun High School. But apparently Larry King had a henchman named Larry, who operated like a gatekeeper almost, who would tell Alicia things like, "Someone is waiting downstairs, you better be good." She tells a story about being flown to a small airport in California and taken to an Embassy Suites type motel. The trip was strictly organized by Larry King. 2 businessmen entered the room. One man had sex with a boy named Danny King and the other with Alicia. No money was paid to the children. Alicia described the man she was forced to be with as violent. He reportedly slapped her, threw her around, and threatened her with a knife. He threatened to cut off her nipples if she did not perform oral sex. Alicia was afraid and crying throughout the 6-hour ordeal. And when the men left, both children were terrified. They were afraid to even take a shower for fear that the men would return. Now, when questioned about the satanic cult activity, Alicia stated that Troy Boner, I'm going to call him Boner, don't be childish, because Bonner would have 2 N's, but this is B-O-N-E-R. I'm going to call him Boner, and Danny King were involved. Okay, so she said that at one time, Danny King was considered extremely anti-God. She described a house on Leavenworth Street used by the group, and she claimed to have seen a pentagram drawn on the kitchen floor and satanic pictures on the walls. Alicia explicitly stated that she saw Bob Wadman coming out of the house on one occasion. Alicia Owen identified a man named James Teddy Broom as one of the key figures in this organization. She described him as a black man with greasy hair, flat nose, and slitted eyes, and said that he walked funny. Broom does the dirty work for Larry King's henchman, Larry, who his last name is unknown. Now, Loretta Smith, if you remember the testimony from part 1, how could you forget? Mentioned Teddy Broom. She said that he was a big part of the satanic cult activity. Loretta claimed that Teddy Broom raped her mother as a warning to Loretta to keep her quiet about the meetings. Now, a lot of Alicia's accounts were corroborated by other witnesses. At 4:40 a.m. on November 25th, 1989, Caradori caught a break when Troy Boner called. He was ready to spill everything. Boner sat through a 6-hour interview that same day, providing the exact kind of corroboration Caradori needed to prove this wasn't just one person's story. And Boner's descent into King's world began in July 1984 at the Max Bar, which was a gay bar, a meeting that was allegedly orchestrated by Alan Baer, who had been scouting Boner for King. Now, Boner had first been introduced to Baer back in August 1983 through a friend. King wasted no time, immediately initiating an inappropriate physical encounter. They reportedly dangled the carrot of easy money, telling Boner he could get paid just for meeting with Baer. This led to Troy moving into the Travelodge Inn for about 3 weeks, during which time he claims that King would visit in the afternoons for sexual encounters. Now, Boner describes visiting Bayer's residence at the Twin Towers, specifically apartment 201. And he detailed a sexual encounter for which he expected $50 for, but ultimately received $400 in $50 bills. Troy describes the trip to Des Moines in February 1984. He claims that Alan Baer drove him and another boy, a 12 or 13-year-old boy named Sean, to the city in a tan Mercedes. Okay. They stayed at the Savoy Hotel, where Troy alleged that several sexual encounters took place while Baer was supposedly there for business meetings. The situation escalated to the point where Troy's mother actually filed a missing person report, and Troy eventually had his girlfriend's mother pick him up in Des Moines, leaving without Baer even knowing. In May 1985, Troy says that he convinced Danny King to get involved for the money, and eventually taking him to Alan Baer's apartment at the Twin Towers. Now, Troy claims that he waited outside for 3 hours while Danny was inside, and when Danny came back, he had $300, and he claimed that nothing happened. But then he later told Troy that he found out that Baer did engage in anal sex with him. So Troy admitted that his role was to kind of be a bird dog, he called it, to recruit other boys for the network. In June or July 1985, Troy alleges that he saw a 15-year-old boy being sexually tortured while beads were inserted into his rectum in the center of a room. There were several men in the room surrounding the boy, masturbating. And Troy claims that he was ordered to participate in the abuse. He identified one of the men as a police officer. So Troy then alleged that Wadman preferred sexual encounters with minors. He mentions another girl involved with Wadman named Hovel, who was apparently a runaway from Chicago. Troy describes a flight taken specifically to have sex with Ron Gilbert. Ron Gilbert, if it's the Ron Gilbert that I looked up, did a shit ton of TV movies, like an insane amount of TV movies. And Troy claimed that both he and Larry King, because this man was a television movie producer, had sexual encounters with Gilbert during the trip, though Troy notes that he received no money for it. So the trip involved Troy, Danny King, Alicia Owens, and 2 unidentified smaller kids. Troy alleges that Larry King and Troy dropped the smaller children off at different locations, and Troy states his belief that these children were actually sold. Okay. So Troy claims that Ron Gilbert was involved in producing pornographic films and describes a man named Robert Anderson who allegedly kept a collection of pornographic photos. Now, Troy identifies Anderson as like a Union Pacific Railroad employee that was like living in La Vista, Nebraska. Enter our third witness, Danny King, who I've mentioned a few times. Gary Caradori sat down with him at the Residence Inn on December 3rd. And when Danny was clearly, he was going through it, he was finding it nearly impossible to talk through the trauma of what he experienced. And he expressed a need to find some kind of relief, just so he can move forward. There was just one big problem, though. Danny had a heavy drug problem, and his memory was fried. He was so disoriented that he couldn't even tell Caradori which month came after December. So despite all of that, he was able to pin down that he first met Alan Baer towards the end of 1983 when he was just like 13 or 14 years old. Danny confirmed that Troy Boner was the one who hand-delivered him to Baer. And he described that, there was a meeting with Alan Baer 2 weeks later, saying that they drank schnapps before engaging in oral sex, and he ended up with $50. I mean, this became like a weekly ritual for about 7 months, and usually going down right after school at Baer's place. But then it gets darker. Baer, introduced Danny to shooting up cocaine, and he was giving this kid a shot in the arm, and it eventually made him like ill, like he couldn't take it. Excuse me. Baer was also using cocaine, and Danny name dropped Larry Jr., King's right-hand man. He also even mentioned the ever-present Deward Finch, who was the superintendent of schools. So Danny claimed that he met the man himself, Larry King, at Baer's residence. And he alleges that King forced him into a violent sexual encounter. And when Danny tried to spit out King's ejaculate, King actually hit him with a shoe. And to add insult to injury, he didn't even get paid for that abuse, like at all. So let's talk about this memo, okay? This is the memo that kind of changed everything, because this was the first time that the names of the players were actually dragged into the light. This document was originally legal advice that DeCamp gave to Senator Lawrence Schmidt in the spring of 1989. DeCamp's advice was cold. He was like, go to the highest authority you can, above the authority who is being accused, though. And DeCamp's notes that this meeting occurred before the public about this memo even knew who Alicia Owen or any of the other victims were. But the DeCamp memo was meant to force these serious allegations into the light, because the traditional channels of justice, like the local police and the FBI, were compromised, and by personal and professional ties to the accused. DeCamp insisted that the Senator Schmidt meet with the regional head of the FBI, Nick O'Hara. And on this occasion, they had a one-on-one. And this was actually before DeCamp even joined. And it was revealed that the primary individual who was being investigated, Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman, was actually really close with Nick O'Hara, the FBI regional head. O'Hara made it very clear how close he was. And he created tension regarding how the FBI would handle the allegations. And so instead of the FBI taking the information provided by Senator Schmidt to investigate Wadman, O'Hara, flips, and he begins interrogating Schmidt and the practices of DeCamp as if they were the suspects. He wanted the witnesses' information too. And DeCamp later warned the senator. He said, look, anyone daring to investigate these allegations is going to get buried by the FBI if they go to Wadman. If they go after Wadman or his associates. So by early January 1990, the streets of Omaha were buzzing with leaks about the Caradori tapes because, they were forced to have a clandestine meeting organized by Senator Jerry Chizek. And this summit brought together Senator Lawrence Schmidt, Chief Dick Roth, Judge Corrigan, and John DeCamp to confront the absolute nightmare captured on these recordings. So Roth laid it out plain. The intimacy between the federal investigators and the accused meant that honest justice and witness protection were useless. They were not going to happen. But as a last-ditch strategy, Judge Corrigan was tasked with dragging the other district court judges into the loop to explain the gravity of it all. But he either couldn't or wouldn't follow through. I think he kind of got scared. And so the public was kind of convinced that the state's most powerful elites were just the devil. I mean, the allegations were openly dragging names like Harold Anderson, Larry King, Robert Wadman, Peter Citron, and Alan Baer through the mud. And they were being linked to this machine of child abuse, narcotics, just a mess, a total perversion of the public office. And these men were untouchable. This created an atmosphere of a perceived cover-up. So DeCamp concluded that, I'm pretty sure that these allegations are real. He's like, he believed him, and he wasn't losing sleep over the lawsuits at all, because the truth was going to set everybody free. The DeCamp memo was leaked in 1990. That memo set the whole state on fire. I mean, after seeing Peter Citron's name in the memo, local parents began questioning their sons. So the boys, they started pouring out the truth. They were detailing abuse they suffered while hanging around Citron. Prosecutors were forced to file charges. Citron's eventually pled guilty and was sentenced to prison as a mentally disordered sex offender. To deal with the chaos, the establishment called in two specific grand juries. First, you had the federal grand jury, summoned by the U.S. attorney with the goal of putting the rumors to rest or to bury them, however you want to take it. Then, just a week after the memo leaked, the Douglas County grand jury was fast-tracked to start hearing allegations in Omaha. And the media, the Omaha World Herald, went for the jugular, running hit piece after hit piece that fixated on the criminal past, the drug habits, and the mental health of the survivors to make sure that the public saw them as total liars. It's no coincidence that Harold Anderson, who I mentioned, who is a part of this, was the president and publisher of the paper at the time. The World Herald used its editorial muscle to mock the committee's investigation. They framed Senator Lorraine Schmidt and John DeCamp as nothing more than conspiracy theorists. They were playing political games. Meanwhile, the Kansas City Star and other out-of-state outlets were busy exposing the cross-state nature of the ring. And the World Herald just kept its foot on the brake, like, nah, we're burying the leads. We're framing this whole thing as a rumor. They didn't want to bring any of this to light. Now, enter Paul Bonacci. He was 22 at this time. Gary Caradori discovered Bonacci in May 1990 at the Douglas County Jail, and he named Alan Baer, Peter Citron, and Larry King as his primary abusers. But according to Bonacci, Larry King was obsessed with climbing the ladder. Okay, desperately trying to get in with the higher ups of the Republican Party. Bonacci alleged that he was taken on many trips. He went to California, Washington, D.C., Des Moines, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Austin, Houston, Dallas, St. Louis, and Miami. He estimated 200 to 300 trips between 1982 and 1986 alone. He claimed that he first met Baer around 1979 in an area known as the Milk Run. It was near the correctional center. And Bonacci was only about 12 years old at the time. Baer would pay him $20 for oral sex, but the abuse was long-term. Bonacci believes that his last sexual encounter was fairly recent. It occurred as late as November 15, 1989. And it was at Baer's apartment in the Twin Towers. He specifically mentions an individual he called Larry Little King, who, went around making threats to scare Bonacci and other victims. And Bonacci states that he believes that he first met Wadman in late 1985 or 1986, too. He claims to have seen him at least two parties. Now, Bonacci describes a meeting with Detective Mike Hoke of the Omaha Police Department. Hoke told Bonacci that Larry King might prosecute him and explicitly stated that there would be no attempt to grant Bonacci formal immunity. Hoax behavior further reinforced that DeCamp's narrative that the Omaha Police Department was actively working to intimidate witnesses was true. It was true. DeCamp was right on it. He knew that the Omaha Police Department were not going to investigate the leads. That wasn't the goal. Bonacci placed Alicia Owen right in the thick of it. He confirmed that she was present at those parties with Bob Wadman. He described what can only be called scavenger hunts, where he was basically used as a bird dog as well to recruit young boys for bear. He alleges he was forced into sexual encounters with numerous individuals during these travels, and he provides the ultimate corroboration by placing Troy, Danny, and Alicia on that same 1985 or 1986 California trip. Now, Bonacci didn't stop there. He name-dropped other Omaha hotspots, too. Caradori's notes from May 14th, 1990, emphasized that Bonacci had not been in contact with Alicia Owen, Troy Boner, or Danny King for several years since 1986 or 1987. He states that he never had much personally to do with Bonacci. Bonacci states that he never had much personally to do with King and simply went wherever he was told to go. Bonacci alleged that the operation used NAMBLA. Now, NAMBLA is a North American Man-Boy Love Association. He claims that they use their literature as a toolkit to groom and normalize the horrific abuse of children. It was founded in 1978. NAMBLA is a notorious advocacy group dedicated to abolishing age of consent laws and freeing predators from prison. They have some weird saying like, something after 8, it's too late, or something like that. It's really messed up. They basically provided a training manual for abuse. They were distributing these sick, pieces of literature that were designed to help adults seduce children under the guise of liberation. They even tried to include themselves into the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, and they kicked them right out. They were like, yeah, nah, that's not what we do here. I mean, and they still have a website. It's actually quite sick. I'm on my work computer now, so I'm not even going to pull it up, but it is very sick that it's still a pretty much operational website. And I will admit that if they still have a website, they have a Wikipedia, there's still likelihood that they are probably still members. They're just deep underground, probably somewhere on the dark web. DeCamp argues that this wasn't just a local mess. I mean, there were high-ranking members of the Franklin Circle who were reportedly plugged into similar rings across the country, like the Boys Town ring. They were sharing resources and swapping referrals for vulnerable kids, but it was a strategy of hiding in plain sight. We kind of talked about this in my Dean Coral episode. Not Dean Coral. Was it Dean Coral? Yes, it was Dean Coral. Because it was my Candyman episode, because it led to those other guys and like John Wayne Gacy and how they were a part of this like very sophisticated ring where they were like sending out literature of all of these boys who were just like on display and like, teaching them ways of being a creep. It's so strange to receive a mailer about boys in the mail. It was wild. The irony here is that these men were prominent members in a different pro-child groups like the Omaha Children's Home and Boys Town, the Knights of Ak-Sar-Ben, which is Nebraska backwards. It's a foundation, but they basically weaponized their respectable public image to gain total access to these kids. The Knights of Ak-Sar-Ben Foundation is basically the inner sanctum of Omaha's business and political elite. I would say it's kind of like the Illuminati, but I probably can't even take it that far. It's pretty local. It's the connective tissue for the scandal, though, because so many of the high profile players who let Franklin Credit Union burn were also prominent members of the Knights of Aksar Ben. And researchers point to their annual coronation ball, which is like this weird ball where they crown a king and a queen and, they dress weird. It's very ritualistic, but many researchers use the coronation ball as ultimate proof of how cliquish and powerful the Omaha establishment really was, especially while the credit union was being slaughtered from the inside. And Lawrence King used his status as a power broker to rub elbows with Aksar Ben leadership. I will say that as I was researching this, it dawned on me like, oh, there are a lot of like insurance companies and financial institutions that are of Omaha. Like, I was like, oh, never really thought about it, but now it makes sense. Now, Bonacci also detailed a horrific snuff film incident, so trigger warning, during that trip to California. Quote, I'm going to quote this. Nicholas and I were given these Tarzan things to put around us and stuff. They told me to fuck the boy and stuff. At first I said no, and they held a gun to my balls and said, do it or else lose them or something like that. I began doing it to the boy and stuff, and Nicholas had anal sex and stuff with him. We were told to fuck him and stuff and beat on him. I didn't try to hurt him. We were told to put our dicks in his mouth and stuff and sit on the boy's penis and stuff, and they filmed it. We did this stuff to the boy for about 30 minutes or an hour when a man came in and kicked us and stuff in the balls and picked us up and threw us. He grabbed the boy and started fucking him and stuff. The man was about 10 inches long and the boy screamed and stuff, and the man was forcing his dick into the boy all the way. The boy was bleeding from his rectum, and the men tossed him and me and stuff and put the boy right next to me and grabbed a gun and blew the boy's head off. The boy's blood was all over me, and I started yelling and crying. The men grabbed Nicholas and I and forced us to lie down. They put the boy on top of Nicholas, who was crying, and they were putting Nicholas's hands on the boy's ass. They put the boy on top of me and did the same thing. They then forced me to fuck the dead boy up his ass, and also Nicholas. They put a gun to our heads to make us do it. His blood was all over us. They made us kiss the boy's lips and eat him out. Then they made me do something I don't want to even write, so I won't. After that, the men grabbed Nicholas's gun to my head, but fired it into the air. I heard another shot from somewhere. I then saw the man who killed the boy drag him like a toy. Everything, including when the men put the boy in the trunk, was filmed. They took me with him and went up in a plane. I saw the bag the boy was in. We went over a thick brush area with a clearing in it. Over the clearing, they dropped the boy. One said the men with the hoods would take care of the body for them. I didn't see Nicholas until the night at the hotel. He and I hugged and held each other for a long while. About 2 hours later, the men, or Larry King, came in and told us to go take a shower since we had only been hosed off at some guy's house. We took a shower together and then were told to put on the Tarzan things. After we were cleaned up and dressed in these things, we were told to put on shorts, socks, and a shirt and shoes and driven to a house where the men were at with some others. They had film and they played it. As the men watched, they passed Nicholas and I around as if we were toys and sexually abused us. They made Nicholas and I screw each other, and one of the men put the dead boy's penis in mine and Nicholas's mouth. I didn't want to write this because the man forced me to bite the boy's penis and balls off. It was gross, and I saw the film where it happened and started freaking out, remembering what they made us do afterwards to the boy. They showed us doing everything to the boy. I was there for about 5 days attending parties, but only recall cutting my wrists, which is why I stayed 2 days in the hospital under a name I can't recall. Some guy paid for me. Bonacci alleged that Larry King was smiling and laughing throughout the entire screening of the footage, and that the men with hoods were part of a satanic group intended to use the boy's remains in a ritual ceremony. In one final bizarre twist, he identified the director of the snuff film, a man they had reportedly picked up in Las Vegas as Hunter Thompson. Now, real quick, end of quote. Hunter S. Thompson, is the writer of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and Gonzo. Now, Hunter Thompson is a weirdo, or was, but that is very specific. Just like the movie producer that he mentioned earlier was very specific. But I just want to say that I don't know that that is the same Hunter Thompson, but that is pretty specific, that this man that was reportedly picked up in Vegas is Hunter Thompson. Now, we have to talk about the S word, and that would be Satanism. Now, look, I get it. It sounds terrifying, but I want to talk about this. It's important because the kind of the point is to be off-putting and anti and kind of like repulsive enough that nobody wants to speak about it. But during the peak of the 1980s, there was a such thing as satanic panic. The satanic panic was the media and law enforcement jumping to conclusions every time an occult practice happened or was reported. And they were basically lumping all of these occult practices into this like one bucket of ritual abuse. And that kind of blurred the lines between the actual theology and the philosophy. And so I kind of want to separate these things. Now, back then, fundamentalist groups and occult experts claimed that everything from serious Satanism to literal hobby interests like Dungeons and Dragons was a front for a massive global conspiracy. But based on the testimony we've seen, my guess is that this specific circle were what's known as Diabolists. And I'm going to break this down. So modern atheistic Satanism is specifically LaVeyan. It is actually an atheistic philosophy. They're not really bowing down to literal Satan. To them, he's just a symbol for the adversary. Okay. It's all about the carnal indulgence. It's all about pride and flipping off social norms. You are your own God, and any worship is strictly for your own ego. That's LaVeyan Satanism. Luciferians are a different breed. They see Lucifer as a figure of radical independence and enlightenment. So kind of like Prometheus, but they reject this idea of being a servant to anyone. So using basically Lucifer as a blueprint for self-mastery. But then you have Diabolists. Now, these are the ones who take the Bible as literal fact. They've just decided to pray for the other team. Okay. But unlike atheists who just like the aesthetic of rebellion, Diabolists are literal disciples of the devil. They're famous for the Black Mass, which is a ritual that basically flips Christian symbolism on its head. So inverted crosses and backwards prayers. It's all about transactional, though. It's transactionalism at its finest, because you basically make a pact with a malevolent entity to secure power or to cause harm. So the real tragedy of the satanic panic was that the world got so distracted by the supernatural theatrics that they flat out ignored the actual crimes that were right there. But that doesn't really change the fact that there are a such thing as Diabolists. They just weren't aware of it at the time. So while everyone was hunting for devil worshippers and occult, boogeymen, They completely missed the very real, very human part of this, the greed, the politics, the slaughter, and it was happening out in the open. So regardless, I said this in part one, regardless of the reason why people were doing this, they were doing this. And fear always fills the gaps where the truth is missing. But by July 1990, Gary Caradori had traveled to Chicago to pin down a witness who could finally connect the Omaha operations to the heavy hitters in D.C. And in a phone call to Senator Lorraine Schmidt, right before he took off, Caradori declared, he said, "I've got it. I've got the photos and the tapes. I've got the smoking gun." He was piloting his private plane back to Lincoln with his 8-year-old son, Andrew, and after a trip to an all-star game in Chicago. But witnesses described that his aircraft literally disintegrated in midair. It was falling out of the sky in pieces rather than a standard engine failure that would lead to a crash. When the NTSB and the FBI officially investigated, they chalked it up to an accident that was caused by a structural wing crack. And the timing was super suspicious. So when they recovered items from the wreckage, those quote unquote smoking gun files, the photos, and the cassette tapes had vanished into thin air. A few personal items were found, though. The very evidence that Caradori bragged about in his final moments were gone, and his last formal sit down had been with Paul Bonacci. And DeCamp makes sure to point that out because Caradori had warned his wife and his inner circle weeks before that if he went down, it wouldn't be an accident. He was convinced the feds were on his tail. The horror didn't end with Gary Caradori's death, though. Instead, it transitioned from a botched investigation into what DeCamp describes as total liquidation of the truth. DeCamp and Senator Schmidt were adamant that the crash site was basically left wide open, claiming that Caradori's briefcase, the one that was packed with these explosive files and smoking gun tapes from Chicago, was either swiped or buried before the official teams even showed up. And while the NTSB and the FBI were quick to slap an accident label on it, blaming a fatigue crack in the wing, DeCamp wasn't buying that. He points out that his supposed wing issue was crap. And it was missing in action in every other plane model. And he was arguing that a midair disintegration is sabotage. Total sign of sabotage. Now, following his death, the DeCamp memo became a vessel, a primary vessel for the information Caradori had spent months collecting. 12 days after everything settled, the Douglas County grand jury dropped their report, and it was total slap in the face. The official report branded the victims' accounts as, quote, a carefully crafted hoax, effectively killing any legal pressure on the big people in the DeCamp memo. Then came the real issue. The system went after the survivors. Alicia Owens was prosecuted for perjury. She was slapped with a 15-year sentence. She received way more time than any of the actual sex offenders. The system ultimately buried the truth by pathologizing the survivors. So Paul Bonacci and Alicia Owen were considered crazy. They slapped a diagnosis on them of dissociative disorders. They found a sick way to weaponize their trauma, and they ensured that the public and the courts viewed their accounts as nothing more than hallucinations of an insane person. Dr. Bennett Braun diagnosed Bonacci with DID, arguing it was the direct result of trauma-based mind control and ritualistic slaughter. DID is dissociative identity disorder. It's a super complex mental health condition that typically is characterized by the presence of two or more distinct personalities that are called alters. They reframed a medical tragedy as a legal disqualifier, and they used his alters as a way to label him a pathological liar or a schizophrenic. John DeCamp and the victims' advocates argued that DID was actually proof of the abuse, and the children developed these distinct states specifically to survive the ritualistic and systematic abuse. It's interesting because not too long ago, maybe a year or two ago, I saw a TikTok. I think I mentioned this on the episode before, of this girl who was suffering from DID. I somehow fell into mental illness TikTok. I don't know, schizophrenia talk, schizo talk, or whatever it's called. But it used to be called multiple personality disorder. And you can just think of it like the movie Split, right? But the way she described it was, and this scared me. She said that she had DID, and usually her alters pass the baton in a way. Hey, I'm the new one. You know, she had, the few that she's known and she's always known, but then she got a new one. And her video was ultimately about, and she was panicked in the video, about how she had a new alter and that one did not make itself known, nor was it passing the baton, aka telling the previous alter or the one after what it was doing before. So like when her alters alternate, she was missing time because she had an alter that wasn't telling the next alter what was going on. It was crazy because I was like, this is really, really upsetting to think about how you have all of these different identities. They have their own names. Some speak different languages. They said that Paul Bonacci spoke German. One of his identities spoke German. They have all these different experiences. They have all these very unique characteristics. And then you have one that isn't maybe as artistic or isn't maybe as communicative. And so now you just missing hours of time. You have no idea what you did. That was scary to think about. And I know that's not unheard of, but the way she explained it, because she was absolutely panicked. She was like, I don't know what he or she was doing. But reading this book, it was very interesting to hear about how they use the mental illness against these people, because it does work both ways, right? Like we can assume that a person with dissociative identity disorder may actually be saying things that may not be true or embellishing things that are true based on the personality. But that, to me, again, does not necessarily absolve the people that are being accused of actually being investigated. You can't just be like, oh, no, that person's crazy. Because I do believe that is the part of this that does matter, which is that, like we just said, trauma creates a lot of these behaviors. The doctor said it was a direct result of trauma-based mind control and ritualistic slaughter. So you can't, these people have kind of created these sub-identities to be able to handle the stress of what they're experiencing, while their true selves takes a back seat. This was sick to do. If a witness's account was too consistent or too graphic, they were branded as coached. If they show literal signs of fragmentation, which is a symptom of DID, they were dismissed as mentally incompetent. And these witness victims were threatened with prison sentences, lengthy prison sentences for perjury if they did not retract their statements. Owen is the main example of this too, because despite the corroboration of her details by the other investigators and other witnesses, she was indicted for perjury anyway. She had a 9 to 27 year sentence that she had to serve, and they basically used her as a warning to any other potential witnesses. You will go to jail. And instead of investigating the men that Boner accused, the grand jury focused on him. Under immense pressure and the threat of perjury charges, Boner eventually recanted his testimony. And witnesses were often kept in state custody or psychiatric facilities where they were accessible to the individuals that were associated with the ring. This definitely led to voluntary recantations that DeCamp argued was obtained under duress or during psychological manipulation. Troy Boner receded from the public eye after the investigation's collapse. He was struggling with psychological aftermath of these events and the trauma of being labeled as a liar by the state. And he passed away in 2004 at the age of 34. His death was attributed to a drug overdose. One down. And naturally, the Omaha World Herald weaponized the grand jury report to bury the truth under a conspiracy theory narrative. And they dragged the accounts into the same bucket as Satanic Panic. They found the perfect way to bury the truth. They dismissed the ritualistic horrors that these kids were saying happened to them as nothing more than pop culture hallucinations or a byproduct of overzealous therapists. And that made it easy to slap a hoax label on it and just move on. As far as the actual perpetrators, like Larry King, he was hit with a 15-year federal prison sentence, but it was strictly for the financial stuff. He never saw a day for the alleged child abuse, even though he lost a $1 million suit to Paul Bonacci. The full amount was never paid. He was in jail. But the judgment stood as a formal acknowledgement of the claims. Either that or he wanted them to go away. That's usually what predators say. Peter Citron, he holds the honor of being the only player to actually do time for sex crimes, but it wasn't for these. After the memo blew his cover, he pled guilty to systematic abuse of teenage boys and was hauled off as a mentally disturbed sex offender. By the time they ended the probe into the Franklin pedophiles, the survivors weren't just being ignored, they were being erased. Alan Baer, was cleared of any wrongdoings in 1990 by the Douglas County Grand Jury. And Baer remained a significant figure in Omaha's business and social circles. He continued to manage his family's business. He remained active in the community, and he didn't die until 2002 at the age of 81. Naturally, the Omaha World Herald weaponized that report. Duh. Official probes into the Franklin scandal fizzled after the eventual collapse of the legislative committee between 1990 and 1991. But the million-dollar question is whether these kids were just making it up. When you look through the lens of child advocacy and criminal justice, experts generally break this down into three realities. There are the cold, hard stats, okay? There are the complexities of the accounts that cannot be ignored, and the dynamics of the cover-up itself. Statistically, kids pulling false abuse allegations out of thin air is remarkably rare. And when a hoax actually happens, it's usually because adults are pulling the strings, not because a child decided to independently invent a horror story. Now, mind you, I acknowledge that Alicia and Troy and Paul were adults by the time they started telling these stories. But again, and I said this in part 1, the details are very specific. They're all mentioning the same people. Forensic interviewers specifically hunt for specific markers to see if a story is totally fake. And in this Franklin garbage, Alicia, Troy, and Danny, they're all dropping the identical stories, the floor plans of specific houses, the dental issues or scars of these men, their code names, the locations. than everything, all before they even had the opportunity to talk. And let's be real, kids gain absolutely nothing from this. I mean, sure, in Omaha, these witnesses were met with like threats and a ticket to prison. But psychologically, children are way more likely to bury the abuse just to survive than they are to invent a nightmare that ruins their lives later down the line. I mean, research also proves that these weren't just random events. It was systemic grooming. Because whether you believe in the Satan stuff or not, it's effective. And experts point out that the level of graphic sexual knowledge also matters. It's way beyond anything a kid that age could invent. They had to have lived it. And like we talked about with DID, the brain has a way of compartmentalizing memories to survive trauma. That's impossible to fake, especially throughout the years, especially under intense psychiatric evaluation. It's the body's physical evidence of a mind that is completely broken. You know, the Omaha grand jury, when they called this a hoax, they started to claim that the witnesses were coached by Caradori and DeCamp. But they completely ignored the cold physical evidence too. There were ledger irregularities. There were suspicious bodies, which, ultimately this hoax thing was just used to shield powerful people. But I would also say that there is no kid that is that good of an actor in such a short period of time. The Franklin scandal uncovers a sickening revolving door. You got Nebraska's foster care system that allegedly was allegedly weaponized by Larry King and his circle to traffic the very children they were supposed to protect. They used law to bury the survivors, Alicia, Paul, Troy, Danny. The Omaha elite ensured that it remained hidden, all of this. And ultimately, the Franklin legacy stands as a reminder of how the powerful can effectively erase their crimes. There was a film, and I linked it in the show notes. It's not good quality at all. The film was called, it's a documentary. It was a TV documentary. It was produced by Yorkshire Documentary, a UK-based network, in 1993, and it was called The Conspiracy of Silence. It's in the show notes. It was supposed to air on the Discovery Channel in the States, but it was pulled from the schedule hours before it was supposed to broadcast on May 3rd, 1994. It was an investigation into the Franklin Credit Union scandal and the allegations of child sex trafficking. The crew had traveled to Omaha. They interviewed key figures, John DeCamp, Paul Bonacci, and Alicia Owen. The Discovery Channel had paid $70,000 for the North American rights. But when it was supposed to air, the Discovery Channel received a ton of threats, and the network abruptly canceled the broadcast, and the documentary was buried. Discovery said it was unresolved legal issues. So it was leaked. An unedited rough cut of the documentary was leaked by a technician or someone in the production house. And for years, the documentary was circulating as a VHS rip within true crime and conspiracy communities. But it eventually found its way to the internet and on YouTube. The leaked version contains the raw interviews of the victims describing, the parties at the Twin Towers, the flights to the East Coast, the involvement of the Omaha criminals, pedophiles. There are also interviews of Alicia Owen on the internet. But this documentary is a visual record of the witness testimonies before they were discredited by the grand jury. And it shows Paul Bonacci and it shows Alicia Owen at the time when they were still actively seeking justice. It also talks about Gary Caradori, the investigator who died in that plane crash. So if you want to check that out, I highly suggest you do. It's definitely worth it. But this is the end of part 2 for Lawrence E. King and the Franklin scandal. And like I've said, and I keep on saying it, y'all. Nobody is this good. Like, especially just out of nowhere. Nobody just pops up and calls a random investigator and be like, yo, all of this stuff happened to me to this level of detail. And I just made it up off the cuff. Like, I'm just like freestyling. Mentioning names, mentioning location, mentioning cars, mentioning physical characteristics, mentioning years, dates, other victims that happen to also have been missing, by the way. You got 4 witnesses who remembers names because clearly they used a lot of real names, faces, and everything. How many cases could you have solved had you taken this seriously? All because you don't want to let 12 perverts get in trouble for it. You okay with kids going missing though? That is fucked up and that is insane to me. I can't get over how insane that is. This country has time and time again proven that it does not give a fuck about its kids. I don't know why it pretends like it does. So, catch me next week or 2 weeks, and we're going to talk more about some more awful things because I cannot wait to get off this topic. Peace.